Welcome back to Annie Breaks It Down, where we ask the one question that no one seems to be able to answer. What on earth is happening? What if I told you that US Marines were deployed on the streets of Los Angeles? Not to fight a foreign enemy, but to detain American civilians. Because that actually happened. President Donald Trump deployed the National Guard and even active duty Marines to Washington, D.C., Portland, Los Angeles, and maybe Chicago. His justifications? It depended on the city. In DC and Chicago, he said it was to reduce crime. In LA and Portland, the goal was to suppress protests against ICE. But here's the thing. This wasn't just about helping police. This was the federal government sending military forces into US cities preemptively in a way that stretched legal precedent like never before. Let's start with Washington, D.C. Trump leaned on D.C. Code sections 49 through 409. Basically, it says the president, through the Secretary of Defense, can call the National Guard for drills, exercises, and, quote, other duties as the president may prescribe. Historically, other duties have been used for things like snowstorms, inaugurations, and handling big protests, not sustained law enforcement, not a de facto city police force. And here's the gray area. The DC mayor usually requests guard support, but technically, the president doesn't have to wait. Trump used this loophole to justify ongoing crowd control. Past presidents mostly acted reactively, as in something happened that spurred the deployments. They didn't act preemptively to prevent crime. Eisenhower, for instance, federalized the Arkansas National Guard in 1957 to enforce school desegregation in Little Rock. He wasn't out preventatively patrolling the streets. Lyndon B. Johnson federalized the Guard during the Detroit and D.C. race riots during the Civil Rights Movement, when people were literally setting whole neighborhoods on fire. By framing unrest as a permanent threat, Trump claimed the power to deploy soldiers whenever he wanted. And that's not just a response to a crisis. That's how executive overreach begins. Now, Los Angeles. Here's where things get trickier. About 4,700 troops were deployed, 4,000 National Guard members, and 700 US Marines. Here's why that matters. The Guard can sometimes operate in this gray area under state law. But Marines? They're federal military. And federal troops aren't allowed to enforce domestic law. So, while the Guard might loosely fit under other duties, sending Marines to patrol the streets and protect ICE facilities is legally sketchy, to say the least. California Governor Gavin Newsom and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass argued that the situation was under control and that the federal intervention was an overreach. Yet, the Marines still participated, and on June 13th, they went even further. Outside the Wilshire Federal Building, U.S. Marines detained an American civilian. Think about that. Active duty combat troops trained for war carrying out arrests on U.S. soil. That wasn't just an escalation, it was a line America was never supposed to cross. In September, federal judge Charles Breyer ruled that the deployment violated the Posse Comitatus Act, noting that there was no rebellion and that local police could handle it. Trump appealed, and now the case is in the Ninth Circuit. Portland followed a similar pattern, just smaller. About 200 to 300 National Guard troops. Oregon Governor Tina Kotek argued that it violated the law. And in Chicago, details are murkier, but the framing of reducing crime is another example of proactive, preventative policing using military forces. At this point, the obvious question is any of this even legal? The Posse Comitatus Act from 1878 limits federal troops from doing domestic law enforcement. And the Insurrection Act lets the president act only in cases of rebellion or when federal authority is threatened. The National Guard is different. Under a governor, it's not federal military. You can use them for law enforcement. But once the president takes control of the National Guard, they're considered federalized and they fall under the Posse Comitatus. Historically, presidents respected these lines. Bush Sr. deployed troops in LA after Governor Pete Wilson requested it during the 1992 riots that followed the Rodney King verdict. Lyndon B. Johnson federalized the Guard only after governors admitted to being overwhelmed. Lincoln and George Washington, they deployed troops to defend the Republic itself from secessionists during the Civil War or the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, not to preventatively patrol cities. Trump's 2025 deployments didn't fit these models. They stretched legal interpretations and treated civil unrest as if it were insurrection. That break in tradition raises the next question. What vision did Trump himself lay out for the military's role inside America? We got the clearest answer at Quantico, where hundreds of the nation's top generals and officers were gathered for an extraordinary meeting. And there, in his own words, Trump sketched a military not as a last resort safeguard of the republic, but as a standing force for policing cities and punishing dissent. Trump and his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, didn't mince words. Trump declared that American cities should be used as training grounds for the military, turning urban streets into battlegrounds. Then he warned of an enemy within. He never defined who that was, but the message was clear. Anyone opposing him could wear that label. And Hegseth doubled down, attacking the military's own leadership and calling to strip away whistleblower protections and diversity programs. Together, their message wasn't just about security. It was about reshaping the military into a political weapon. This wasn't just a speech. It was a vision for domestic military presence, politicized and proactive, blurring the line between defense and law enforcement. Here's the bigger picture. From Washington to Lincoln, military deployments were about defending federal authority and the republic itself. Hoover crushing the bonus army or civil rights-era presidents suppressing unrest? Those were darker echoes. Military force against civilians rather than threats to the state. Trump's deployments? They sit uncomfortably between the two. Civil unrest was treated like secession, and protesters treated like rebels. By stretching laws like the Other Duties Clause and involving federal troops in domestic policing, Trump is challenging the limits of executive power. It raises big questions about civil liberties, state authority, and the role of the military in our democracy. When is protecting the republic necessary, and when does it cross a line into suppressing dissent? That's the question that Trump's 2025 deployments force us to confront.